The proposal made you cry. The ring on Kat's finger felt like the perfect ending. But here's the truth nobody told you. That engagement was never meant to be the finish line. The real plan for Kat and Elliot was so much bigger, so much more emotional, and it almost happened. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the ending fans never got to see. When The Way Home ended, most fans walked away happy. Kat and Elliot survived everything the show threw at them. He got shot. He almost died in an explosion. And yet somehow, he made it back to the present day and gave Kat a proposal she said yes to without hesitation. For a show built on time travel and heartbreak, it felt like the writers gave this couple the soft landing they deserved. But here's the part that changes everything you thought you knew about that ending. The writers never planned for the story to stop there. In their minds, the engagement was just the beginning of the next chapter, not the final page. They were building towards something much bigger, something they had already started planting seeds for earlier in the season, and then the cancellation news arrived and changed everything. Executive producers Alexandra Clarke and Conkie have both spoken openly about this since the show ended, and what they revealed paints a very different picture of where Kat and Elliot were headed. According to them, if the show had gotten a 5th season, the writers would not have stopped at an engagement. Elliot and Kat would definitely have gotten married. That's right, an actual wedding, not just a promise of one. Think about what that means for a couple who spent 4 seasons chasing each other across different decades, dodging danger, family secrets, and literal life-or-death situations just to be together. A wedding wasn't just a plot point for them, it would have been the emotional payoff the entire show had been building towards since season 1. Fans got the proposal, but they never got to see Kat walk down the aisle surrounded by everyone who fought so hard to help her and Elliot find their way back to each other. Yahoo! But the writers didn't stop there. They also had something even more personal in mind, something that ties directly back to conversations the show had already teased on screen. This wasn't some random idea the writers threw out after the fact. It was something baked into the story already, something Elliot himself had brought up before the show ended. And that detail is where things get really interesting, because it changes the way you look back at scenes you already watched. So here's the reveal that might catch you off guard. The writers wanted Kat to get pregnant again. This wasn't just a passing idea floated in an interview after the fact. It was something the show had already set up through Elliot himself. At one point, he actually brings up the idea of having another baby with Kat, and her response wasn't a firm no. She told him it was still something they could talk about, that it was open for discussion. That single line, easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention, was actually the writers planting a seed for a storyline they never got to fully grow. Conkie confirmed this directly, saying she personally wanted to see Kat get pregnant again and that Elliot had already brought it up earlier in the story. Her exact words carried real emotion behind them. She said she would have loved to see that storyline happen. Think about what that would have meant for these two characters. Kat already has a daughter, Alice, who is a huge part of the show's heart, and the reason the whole time travel mystery started in the first place. Adding a new baby into the mix with Elliot would have given their relationship an entirely new layer, a fresh start built on everything they survived together. It would have shown Kat stepping into a new version of motherhood, this time with a partner who chose to stay, who fought to come back to her, and who wanted a future with her on purpose. This also would have deepened the emotional stakes for Alice. Imagine watching her navigate becoming an older sister while still dealing with her own complicated relationship with time travel, her mother, and her own future with Max. A pregnancy storyline wouldn't have just been about Kat and Elliot. It would have rippled through the entire Landry family, adding new tension, new joy, and new questions about how time travel and family history intertwine with the next generation. Instead, the show had to wrap all of that potential into a single finale, giving us hints of a future instead of actually showing it to us. The ring on Kat's finger was never meant to be the end of her story. It was meant to be the start of something the writers clearly loved imagining, but never got the chance to write. While Kat and Elliot's unfinished story hits the hardest, they weren't the only couple whose future got cut short. Dell, played by Andie MacDowell, also had a storyline that was meant to keep evolving. By the end of the series, Dell had gotten her closure with Colton thanks to one final trip through the pond, and she was finally ready to move forward with Sam. But according to the writers, that relationship wasn't meant to jump straight out into anything traditional. Conkie explained that she imagined Del and Sam building a much more modern relationship as opposed to tying the knot. In other words, no rushed wedding, no fairy tale ending forced onto her story. Del's arc was going to be about a woman who had already lived through so much loss and time travel chaos, choosing love on her own terms, at her own pace, without following the same path everyone expects. Yahoo! That detail matters more than it might seem at first. Del's character had spent the entire show as the emotional anchor for the family, someone who carried grief, secrets, and decades of unanswered questions. Giving her a modern, non-traditional relationship with Sam instead of a conventional wedding would have shown real growth. A woman finally living for herself instead of holding everything together for everyone else. It's a quieter storyline compared to Kat and Elliot's, but it's just as meaningful. And it's another piece of the show's future that got left on the table. Then there's Alice. By the end of the series, Alice is stepping into her own future. One that hints at a possible relationship with Max, and a career that could take off in a big way. The writers have talked about imagining Alice becoming a star, with her song climbing the charts and her music career taking flight. But here's the thing. Alice's story was always tied to time travel just as much as Kat's was. She's the one who ends the series jumping into the pond again with her mother, which means her future was never meant to be simple. A real season 5 would have given us the chance to actually watch her navigate fame, love, and the pull of the pond all at the same time, instead of leaving us to imagine it ourselves. When you put all these pieces together, a real pattern starts to show up. Every major character was standing at the edge of a much bigger story when the show got canceled. Kat and Elliot were heading toward marriage and possibly a new baby. Del was building something real and modern with Sam. Alice was on the edge of stardom while still carrying the weight of the family's time-traveling secret. None of these stories were finished. They were paused mid-sentence right when things were getting good. What makes this even more emotional is hearing it directly from the people who created these characters. The writers weren't just throwing out random ideas when asked what could have happened next. They were describing storylines they had already started building, storylines they clearly wished they had the time to finish. There's a difference between a writer making something up on the spot and a writer describing a plan that already existed in their head before the cancellation hit. This falls firmly into the second category, and that's what makes it sting a little more. It also changes the way we look back at the finale itself. The proposal, the engagement ring, that emotional moment by the pond, it all still works as an ending. But knowing what was supposed to come after adds a bittersweet layer to it. Kat and Elliot's story wasn't rushed because the writers ran out of ideas. It was rushed because the world ran out of time for them to tell it properly. The wedding we didn't see, the baby that was still up for discussion, the modern romance Del deserved, all of it existed somewhere in the writer's room, fully imagined, just never brought to life on screen. So when fans say the ending felt a little too neat, a little too wrapped up in one episode, now you know why. It wasn't meant to be wrapped up that fast. It was meant to breathe across an entire extra season, giving every character the space to grow into the future the writers had already imagined for them. Instead, we got a glimpse, a hint, a door left open just enough to make us wonder. And honestly, that might be the most fitting ending of all for a show about time travel. Because just like the pond itself, this story's real ending is still somewhere out there, waiting for a version of the future that never got the chance to happen. The show never saw this coming. One moment, the writers were deep in planning mode for a story that would keep unfolding for years. The next, they were being told to wrap everything up in a single season. This wasn't a slow fade out or a mutual decision reached after years of declining numbers. It happened fast, and it happened while the creative team still had a much longer road mapped out for these characters. That gap between what they were planning and what they were suddenly forced to do is exactly where this whole story gets interesting. Here's what most fans don't realize. Shows like this one don't usually write season by season with no bigger picture in mind. Writers' rooms build out story arcs that stretch across multiple seasons, mapping character growth, relationship milestones, and major reveals years in advance. That's how you get slow burn romances, long-term mysteries, and emotional payoffs that actually feel earned instead of rushed. The Way Home was no different. Behind the scenes, the team had already started laying groundwork for storylines that wouldn't fully pay off until a future season. Storylines involving marriage, family expansion, and deeper relationship growth for almost every major character. They weren't guessing about what came next, they already had a direction. Then the news came. The show wouldn't be getting that next season. And suddenly, everything the writers had been quietly building toward had to be either cut completely or squeezed into whatever time was left. Imagine spending months, maybe longer, imagining how a couple's love story would unfold over another full season, complete with a wedding, complete with new milestones, only to be told you have one final stretch of episodes to say everything you meant to say over a much longer stretch of time. That's the exact position the writers found themselves in. This kind of last-minute shift changes everything about how a story gets told. When you know you have a whole season ahead of you, you can let moments breathe. A proposal can happen, and then you can spend an entire season showing the lead up to the wedding, the planning, the doubts, the family drama that comes with it. But when that time gets taken away, writers are forced to compress years of intended storytelling into a matter of episodes. Slow builds become rushed reveals. Long-term arcs become quick mentions, and endings that were supposed to feel like a natural next step in a much bigger journey instead have to double as a full stop. This is exactly what happened with Kat and Elliot. The proposal fans saw wasn't the writers deciding that was the perfect place to end their story. It was the writers doing the best they could with the ending they were handed. The wedding, the pregnancy storyline, all of that had to be left behind, not because the writers changed their minds, but because the door to tell that part of the story simply closed before they were ready. What makes this even harder to process is that the writers didn't get a slow warning either. There wasn't a gradual sense that the show was winding down over multiple seasons, giving them time to plan a graceful send-off from the very beginning. Instead, they had to pivot in real time, taking storylines meant to unfold gradually and finding a way to give them some kind of closure without the space they originally counted on. That's an incredibly difficult task for any writer. You're not just wrapping up a season, you're trying to wrap up years of character development, unresolved plot threads, and emotional promises made to your audience, all while working within a timeline you never planned for. And this is why hearing the writers talk about it afterward carries so much weight. When Alexandra, Clarke, and Heather Conkie describe what could have happened in a future season, they aren't inventing ideas after the fact to please curious fans. They're describing plans that already existed before the cancellation forced their hand. That distinction matters. It's the difference between speculation and truth, between what if and what was actually going to happen. The wedding, the pregnancy, the deeper arcs for Del and Alice, none of it was fan theory or wishful thinking. It was the actual plan, interrupted. So when you rewatch that finale now, knowing this, it hits differently. The proposal wasn't the writers choosing the perfect ending. It was the best possible ending they could build under pressure, using pieces of a much bigger story that never got the chance to fully unfold. And that's what makes this cancellation story so quietly heartbreaking. It's not just about a show ending, it's about writers who had already imagined a beautiful future for these characters, and having to say goodbye to that vision before they ever got to put it on screen. Let's talk about the parts of this story that almost nobody discusses when they talk about the way home ending. Everyone focuses on the proposal, the ring, the tears, but if you actually listen closely to what the writers said in their interviews, you start to realize the real plan was so much richer than a simple happy ending. It wasn't just about giving Kat and Elliot a nice moment to close out the show. It was about giving them an entire new chapter of life together, one built on marriage, growth, and something even bigger. Start with the wedding itself, because this detail alone reshapes how you think about the finale. The show gave us an engagement, a beautiful, emotional moment where Elliot finally puts a ring on Kat's finger after everything they survived together. But according to the people who actually wrote this story, that engagement was only step one. The real plan was for Kat and Elliot to get married. Not hinted at, not implied, actually shown. A real wedding, with all the emotional weight that comes with two people who spent years being pulled apart by time, distance, and danger, finally standing in front of everyone who mattered and making it official. Think about how different the show's tone would have felt if we had gotten to see that unfold across an entire season instead of compressed into a single proposal scene. But here's where things get even more personal. And honestly, a little more emotional. The writers didn't just want Kat and Elliot to get married, they wanted to give them the chance to build something new together. Something that ties back to a conversation the show had already planted earlier without most viewers even realizing its significance. At one point, Elliot brings up the idea of having a baby with Kat. It's a quiet moment, easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention, but Kat doesn't shut it down. She tells him it's still something they can talk about, that it's open for discussion. That single sentence wasn't filler dialogue. It was the writers quietly setting up a storyline they fully intended to explore if they had gotten the chance. Heather Conkie confirmed this herself, saying she personally wanted to see Kat get pregnant again and that this wasn't some random idea pulled out of nowhere. It was already something the story had been building toward. Picture what that would have meant for Kat's character. She's already a mother to Alice, a daughter whose entire existence is tangled up in time travel, family secrets, and generational trauma. Watching Kat step into motherhood again, this time with a partner who chose her completely, who fought his way back through time just to be with her, would have added a whole new emotional layer to her story. It wouldn't have just been about a baby. It would have been about Kat finally getting the kind of stable, chosen family she never fully had growing up. And this wouldn't have just affected Kat and Elliot. Think about Alice. She would have suddenly found herself becoming an older sibling while still figuring out her own relationship with time travel, her own feelings for Max, and her own place within this complicated family history. A new baby in the family wouldn't have been a simple side plot. It would have rippled through every relationship on the show, adding fresh tension, fresh questions, and fresh emotional stakes for a family that's already been through so much. This is what makes the actual finale we got feel so different once you know this information. The ring on Kat's finger wasn't meant to be the final image of her story. It was meant to be the opening scene of a much longer journey, one filled with wedding planning, difficult conversations about starting a family again, and the day-to-day reality of finally getting to build a life with someone after years of chaos. Instead, all of that got compressed into subtext, into a single hopeful line of dialogue that fans now have to imagine the rest of on their own. It's a strange kind of bittersweet knowing your favorite couple's story wasn't just left open-ended by accident, but because there was an entire future already planned for them that never got the chance to exist on screen.